The night was cold. The air in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was filled with the faint scent of pine and the distant sound of church bells. It was December 24th, 1945. World War II had just ended, and the holiday spirit was supposed to be a healing balm for a weary nation. But for the Sodder family, the nightmare was only beginning. Imagine a house full of life, 9 children tucked away dreaming of Christmas morning. Now, imagine that life turning into a literal furnace. 5 children vanished into the smoke that night, but they didn't just die, they disappeared. No remains, no bones, no closure. For over 80 years, the world has asked one single haunting question: how does a human being burn into nothingness? Tonight, we step behind the midnight to investigate the coldest of cold cases: the Sodder children. To understand the tragedy, we must understand George Sodder, an Italian immigrant who built a successful trucking business from nothing. He was the definition of the American dream: hardworking, blunt, and fiercely opinionated. George had a habit of speaking out against the Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, in the close-knit Italian-American community of West Virginia. This didn't just make him unpopular, it made him a target. But the warnings started long before the first spark. In the months leading up to that fateful night, strange shadows began to surround the Sodder home. A man claiming to be an insurance salesman once walked onto their porch, pointed at the fuse boxes, and told George, "These will cause a fire someday." George had the house inspected, and the power company confirmed the wiring was safe. Then came another man who looked at George's 2 eldest sons and said, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." The Sodders thought it was just bitter talk. They didn't know it was a countdown. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, George noticed a strange car parked on the main street, its occupants watching his younger children as they played. The predator was watching the prey. The stage was set for a horror that no one could have imagined: the midnight call and the first spark. The house fell silent at 10 p.m. 5 of the younger children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, asked to stay up late to play with their new toys. Their mother, Jennie, agreed, as long as they remembered to lock the doors and turn off the lights before coming to bed. At 12:30 a.m., the silence was shattered by the shrill ring of the telephone. Jennie walked downstairs to answer it. On the other end was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize. The woman asked for a name Jennie had never heard. In the background, Jennie could hear the clinking of glasses and a strange, chilling laughter. When Jennie told her she had the wrong number, the woman laughed again and hung up. As Jennie walked back to her room, she noticed something odd. The lights were still on, the curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. The children, usually so disciplined, had forgotten everything. She fixed the house and went back to sleep. But at 1 a.m., a heavy thud hit the roof. It sounded like a rubber ball rolling down the side of the house. Jennie listened for a moment, but silence returned. Half an hour later, the smell of smoke began to crawl into her room. The house was on fire. The failed heroism of George Sodder. George and Jennie, along with their 4 oldest children and the youngest baby, escaped into the freezing December night. But the other 5 were still upstairs, trapped in the attic. This is where the story turns from a tragedy into something far more sinister. George Sodder was a man of action. He ran to the side of the house to grab his ladder, the one that stayed leaned against the wall every single day of the year. It was gone. Someone had moved it. Desperate, he ran to his 2 coal trucks. He intended to drive them close to the house and climb onto the roof to reach the attic window. These trucks were his livelihood. He maintained them perfectly. But that night, both trucks, which had worked perfectly just hours before, refused to start. The engines groaned but stayed dead. He ran to the rain barrel to get water, but it was frozen solid. He tried to call the fire department, but the telephone line was dead. George stood in the snow, his feet bare, watching his house become a funeral pyre. He screamed the names of his 5 children, but the only response was the roar of the flames. In just 45 minutes, the 2-story house collapsed into a pile of white-hot ash. The fire department's sinister silence. As the flames reached toward the midnight sky, neighbors desperately tried to call the fire department. But in a strange and terrifying twist, the operator never answered. One neighbor was so desperate that he drove personally to the fire station to report the blaze. The station was only 2 miles away, a distance that should have taken minutes. Yet, the fire department did not arrive until 8 a.m. the next morning. By then, the house was nothing but a smoking graveyard of white ash. Why the delay? The fire chief claimed they had no driver available or that the trucks wouldn't start. It was an excuse that felt like a betrayal. George and Jennie Sodder spent the morning sifting through the remains of their lives looking for their children's bones. They knew that no matter how hot a house fire gets, human bones do not simply disappear. They expected to find teeth, fragments, or skulls. But they found nothing. Jennie noticed that heavy kitchen appliances and steel bed frames were still recognizable, not melted. If the fire wasn't hot enough to melt iron, how could it have turned 5 human bodies into thin air? The tampered evidence. As the sun rose over Fayetteville, the mystery only grew darker. The fire marshal, Mattine Hoffman, quickly declared the cause to be a faulty electric circuit. But George challenged him immediately. How could it be electrical when the lights on the first floor were still burning while the attic was on fire? Then George found his missing ladder. It hadn't burned in the fire. It was found 75 feet away, hidden at the bottom of an embankment. Someone had intentionally moved it to ensure no one could reach the attic windows. But the most chilling discovery was the telephone line. A repairman later confirmed that the line hadn't been burned through. It had been cleanly cut with wire cutters. To add to the suspicion, a man was seen near the property during the fire, stealing a part from George's truck engines to ensure they wouldn't start. Every piece of evidence pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated, military-style operation to take the Sodder children. The bone that wasn't theirs. Years passed, but George and Jennie Sodder refused to believe their children were gone. In 1949, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They hired a private pathologist and conducted a new excavation of the site. During the dig, they finally found something: several human vertebrae, pieces of a spine. But the results of the lab test were haunting. The bones belonged to a single individual, a young adult between the ages of 16 and 20. The oldest missing Sodder child was only 14. Even more chilling, the bones showed absolutely no signs of fire damage. They were clean. This meant someone had planted old bones from a cemetery in the debris to mislead the investigation. But why? Who were they trying to protect? And where were the real children? The 1968 mystery, the letter from the past. By 1967, 20 years had slipped away. The famous billboard on Route 19 stood like a silent scream against the West Virginia sky. Then, a mysterious envelope arrived for Jennie Sodder. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his mid-20s. He had the same dark eyes, the same nose, and the same wavy hair as their missing son, Louis. On the back of the photo, a cryptic handwritten note read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil boys, A90, 132, or 35. Hope flared in the Sodders' hearts once more. They hired a private detective to go to Kentucky and find the man in the photo. But in a terrifying twist, the detective disappeared shortly after arriving in Kentucky. The Sodders never heard from him again. Was the photo a genuine sign of life, or a cruel, heartless prank played on a grieving family? The mother in black. Jennie Sodder wore black every day for the rest of her life as a sign of mourning. She turned the site of the fire into a beautiful garden, tending to each flower as if it were one of her lost children. When she passed away in 1989, her final thoughts were still of them. The Sodders spent their entire fortune and traveled thousands of miles seeking the truth, but they never found out what really happened on that Christmas Eve. Today, the hills of Fayetteville still guard that secret, and the fate of the 5 children remains locked in the shadows of history. The Mafia theory, a calculated revenge? The most popular and terrifying theory behind the disappearance of the Sodder children points toward the Italian Mafia. Many believe that George Sodder's outspoken political views and his fierce opposition to Benito Mussolini made him a target for local pro-fascist Italians. It is suspected that on that fateful night, the children were taken from the house before the fire was even started. From there, they might have been trafficked to Italy or raised under false identities with other families right here in America. The cut phone lines, the missing ladder, and the suspicious delay of the fire department, all of it screams of a professional, coordinated hit by an organization with deep roots in the local authorities. Cold reality. Did science fail? On the other hand, skeptics argue that the children simply perished in the fire, and that the forensic teams of 1945 were too inexperienced to find the remains. But this argument falls apart under scrutiny. In the aftermath, investigators found intact food tins and recognizable pieces of furniture beneath the ash. If the fire wasn't hot enough to destroy a tin can, how could it have completely vaporized 5 human skeletons? To this day, no scientist or investigator has been able to answer that question. The Sodder case isn't just a tragedy of a fire. It is a haunting testament to the failure of the American justice system. Conclusion: behind the midnight. If you drive through that spot in Fayetteville today, you might feel a heavy silence in the air, The famous billboard put up by George and Jennie Sodder is long gone, but their grief still echoes through the Appalachian winds. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. These 5 names remain symbols of an unsolved mystery that refuses to die. Did they survive? Did they ever know that their parents spent every waking moment searching for them? Perhaps one day, an old diary or a deathbed confession will finally reveal the truth. But until then, the story of the Sodder children serves as a chilling reminder that behind the veil of midnight, there are mysteries that have no end. What do you think happened? Was it a mafia abduction or a tragic accident that left no trace? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation chilling, like this video and subscribe to Mystery Behind Midnight for more deep dives into the unknown. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, the truth is often darker than the night itself.